Edwin Warfield, the publisher of City Biz, and I'm honored today to interview Maureen Conway from the Aspen Institute and Adrian Scharf, who's the Associate Director of the Institute of the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing at Rutgers University School of Management and Labor Relations. Welcome, Maureen and Adria.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maureen, can you provide an introduction to the program and your role?
Sure. I lead the Economic Opportunities Program at the Aspen Institute. We're a team of about 20, and our mission is to advance policies, strategies, and ideas that help low and moderate income people across the United States connect to opportunity and thrive in today's economy. We're very mindful of the issues of race, gender, geography, and class as we think about sort of where people are, what they need, and what are the issues that we need to address as we try to have more people access the kinds of opportunities in which they can thrive. So we do a variety of things. We kind of get into the weeds of how different things work in different communities across the country. We do a lot of cross-sector dialogue to bring leaders together to focus on issues of opportunity, and we do a variety of public events and communications to engage a broad public in sort of what are the challenges of opportunity in America today. And I should say we have amazing colleagues across the Aspen Institute that we work with, and we also have amazing colleagues beyond the Aspen Institute, like the wonderful colleagues we have at the Rutgers Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing. So yeah, that's a little of what we do.
Thank you, Maureen. So, Adrian, can you explain your role at Rutgers University?
I'm happy to. Thank you so much for having me. I'm the associate director and part of a leadership team at a very unique and important research institute housed at Rutgers University, which has a bit of a mouthful of a name, the Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing. We are the only university-based research center in the world focused on advancing understanding of broad-based forms of employee ownership. And so by employee ownership, I mean models of business ownership in which employees, including the regular frontline employees, have some ownership stake in the business where they work. And that idea of employee ownership is really kind of a broad umbrella term that consists of many different specific types. In the United States alone, you have the employee stock ownership plan and worker cooperatives and trusts and broad-based forms of equity compensation, et cetera. But the underlying idea of this sort of an ownership model of business is that the employees have an ownership stake. And so we at the Institute, we have one of the largest global fellowship programs in the world with about 250 different global fellows connected to our network. We organize several important annual conferences. We sponsor and lead ourselves research. And I personally have what I describe as both the joy and the challenge of really researching, teaching, and educating about this concept of employee ownership. It's a joy because these more economically inclusive models of ownership are so needed at this moment. And it's a challenge because they remain still not widely understood.
So the Aspen Institute in Economic Opportunities Program and Rutgers University Institute for Study of Employee Ownership held the 2024 Employee Ownership Ideas Forum. Maureen, can you share some of the ownership ideas that came out of that forum?
Sure. So I think I'll share just a few. There were so many, I think, that came out of the forum this year. We looked at a variety of different issues. We looked at sort of what are states doing. We looked at some of the issues in rural areas and how employee ownership contributes to rural communities and help those organizations, those communities thrive. We looked at employee ownership and supply chain resilience. There was just a wide variety of topics that we covered. A couple of things, sort of specific things that stick to me. One of the things that came up across a number of different thematic discussions was this idea of sort of culture building and the different ways that employee-owned companies engage in continuous worker training. There's sort of training when you transition to ownership, but then there's the ongoing communication and training and engagement. And so I felt like there was a number of interesting things that were discussed in terms of how organizations do that, how they structure that work, how they make time for it, how they invest in it, some interesting policy things about how different workforce funding streams can support that or other kinds of funding streams. So I felt like there was a lot of interesting conversation around culture building and how that's so important to the success of the enterprise. And sort of, a lot of times when we talk about these kinds of things, we can get stuck in the financing. And there were interesting things about financing too that were discussed, and sort of what are some interesting policy ideas and just sort of field ideas for that. But I think there's some of the intangibles that people really, I felt like, did a great job making more tangible for our audience in terms of how we think about organizational culture and why that's important. And I think one of the things that just really struck me from that was just that the conversation was really grounded in a lot of the values that animate employee ownership. It was really grounded in this idea of, sort of just a fundamental respect for working people and what they bring to the organization. This idea of sort of shared responsibility and shared accountability to one another within the enterprise, and sort of having a sense of common purpose and shared success. And I think it was just interesting to me how all of the sort of operational details and do's and don'ts that sort of were also shared were grounded in this sort of shared sense of values that animate employee ownership. So those are a couple of things that stick with me.
And Adria, how is this year's forum different from the previous years?
Absolutely. This was the second year of our incredible collaboration with Maureen Conway's wonderful team at the Aspen Institute's Economic Opportunities Program. So this was our second Employee Ownership Ideas Forum. And both years have been wonderful. I think this year stood out for me in a couple ways. One was that the momentum that we have built over last year was really palpable. We had more requests for registrations than we could accommodate. We had many people who could not come in person, participating virtually online, and you really stepped into the room and you felt that dynamism and that anticipation for the content and the information and that energy. Secondly, this year we had a particular focus on local communities. Our theme was employee ownership on the ground. So we very intentionally sought to bring to Washington, D.C., literally bring into the Capitol building these powerful stories like Maureen was just describing of innovative experiments and initiatives in shared ownership models from rural communities, from states across the country, the ways individual states are really innovating in terms of creating state level employee ownership kind of initiatives that kind of support this particular ownership form. Just echoing what Maureen just said, it was just a powerful tapestry of stories and anecdotes and narratives that really took you as a participant. I was up on stage, but for much of the time I was in the audience like everyone else, just taking in these incredible stories that connected the dots between why sharing ownership, the level of ownership structure, pairs with and complements a culture of respect. And those two things together can deliver powerful outcomes, both in terms of performance outcomes for businesses and social justice and economic security outcomes for working people.
So Maureen, you recently co-authored an op-ed for Fast Company entitled "Can Employee Ownership Save Capitalism?" Can you share some of your thoughts, especially on the potential role of ESOPs?
Sure. I'm glad you asked about that op-ed. So I think what we're really trying to explore in that conversation is why ESOPs aren't more widespread, right? Why, since there's so many benefits to this structure, why is that? And since it addresses so many, it addresses an issue that is really fundamentally a challenge for a lot of economic opportunities, which is this sort of wealth inequality, which has really become just a wealth chasm, right? If you look at over 90% of equities, of business equities, are held by just the top 10% of households, right? So business wealth drive the inequality in business wealth drives that wealth inequality, and ESOPs are just a great way to think about how do we start to share that wealth in a more sustainable way, right? Not in a way that is sort of like just how do we take it back from one party and give it to another, but how do we start to organize the the ways in which capitalism can provide that wealth from the get-go, right, as it's being created. And I think, sort of as we kind of say in this op-ed, this is like trying to have the good side of capitalism, but address the downside, right? And capitalism has been terrific in terms of like generating wealth and generating innovation and everything, but it hasn't done, sort of it's great on the production side and less good on the distribution side, right? So it really hasn't done a great job in sharing the wealth. So I think ESOPs are a magnificent mechanism for bringing a corrective to that, right? To really having broad-based ownership and having people who are really contributing to the production of that wealth feel like the economy is also working for them. So I think that that's just critically important. And then so we're addressing this question of so since these companies they tend to have better jobs, they tend to provide better outcomes, they provide great business performance, they're good for communities, they're good for job retention in communities. Like there's all this research showing the benefits of them. And so you just start to say, well, why is it that we don't have more of them? And we really looked at sort of the different ways our business supports systems. It's sort of like there's ways that, the accounting system and the legal system and lots of sort of government, business, economic development systems and stuff all don't really include employee ownership, right? And they kind of work against it. So how do we start recognizing that and providing the fixes so that we can have ESOPs really bring the full value that they could bring to our economy and society? So that's kind of what we're trying to get at there.
So, Maureen, let's go back to you started at the Aspen Institute in 1992. Can you share some highlights from your? I apologize for putting the date in. So, we'll start in the 22nd century. So if you can,
so yes, a very long history there. Yes, it's my roots aren't showing, hopefully. So anyway. So I think, I started at the Aspen Institute in 1992, as you said. I was working on this project. It was called Local Employment Approaches for the Disadvantaged. We were visiting different community organizations all across the country, community development finance institutions, small business incubators, various kinds of job training, all kinds of things to sort of see what are they doing to help people in their communities who are struggling to connect to opportunity, and how are they thinking about that? And that work really laid the ground for something that we spent a lot of time looking at, which is this idea of how do you think about the particular industry sectors in your economy and where are the leverage points within those sectors to both support a thriving industry and support thriving among the people who contribute to the success of that industry. And I just have to say that's been my guiding kind of through line for my whole career, is trying to think about how do you make that true in more places, in more industries, in more kinds of organizations. We've tried to think about what's the role of workforce development in making that happen. And I think there's lots of scope for employee ownership to also be a really powerful way to make that happen, so that we start to build the kinds of businesses where business success is not just Wall Street success, it's also Main Street success.
Thank you. And Adrian, can you share more about your role with Rutgers University and the work that you're doing there?
Absolutely, I'm happy to. We are building on our momentum of our collaboration with Maureen and team. We're already working on organizing our next conference, which will be held in June in Silicon Valley. This next conference is called the Future of Equity, and it's focused specifically on equity compensation. So a whole variety of forms of stock-based compensation, from stock options to restricted stock, et cetera, examining the ways that those tools also can be used to expand wealth ownership in the economy. But in my own role, I wear many hats. I'm right now grading a stack of end of semester student final papers. I am conducting a number of research projects, and I lead up an important resource for the teaching community. It's called the Curriculum Library for Employee Ownership. It's a free online library of teaching and research materials focused on employee ownership. It's completely free, and I welcome any of your viewers to check it out and make use of it. The website is cleo.rutgers.edu.
And so, Maureen, please share your vision for what an equitable society looks like.
If I think about an equitable society, right, I think about, because of the work that I've done so many years, I feel like it starts with our structures of work, right? And I feel like it starts with having work where when people work hard, they get at least, maybe they don't get rich, but they can at least get by. And I feel like we've come a long way from that. And I feel like that really fundamentally needs to be what we start focusing on more. We've done a lot of work over the past decade, I would say, on job quality and talking about what is job quality, what are the drivers of job quality, how do we measure job quality, because what gets measured gets managed, and really focusing on that place, because I think there is so much of our life that is spent at work. And the way we shape work can shape our relationships with one another. I think we heard people at the Employee Ownership Ideas Forum speak very powerfully to that. And so I do feel like if we want an equitable society, we really need to take a little bit more seriously, how do we think about what work should look like, and how do we really focus more on making sure that the kinds of jobs we're creating, the kinds of workplaces that we are supporting are the kinds of workplaces that contribute to an equitable society, and that uphold principles of an equitable society.
And Adria, can you share some data points related to inequity, and how do you address race and gender in the workforce?
Absolutely. It's such an important question. Our society is really defined by these quite shocking degrees of both wealth concentration, so concentration of wealth in the hands of a relatively small number, but then also the flip side of that is widespread asset poverty, which you could almost call a crisis of wealthlessness, where you have a very significant percentage of American households actually having no savings, having no net worth, no cushion on which to fall back. And I think that fact, that sense of widespread precarity, underpins a lot of our other social issues. So in terms of data points, we at the Rutgers Institute have a shares laboratory, which is specifically focused on analyzing national data on stock ownership patterns across the economy. And I was really struck by one of our most recent reports looking specifically at race, which found that looking at equity ownership, so looking at all forms of stock ownership, Black working people in the United States owned 2% of the value of the stock. This was in terms of the dollar value of stock, 2% of the dollar value that the white workers, the white survey respondents own. And I believe Hispanic respondents owned something like 27% of the level of wealth that white respondents own. And to put an actual dollar value on that, the African-American respondents on average own something like under $4,500 in stock wealth, again, on average. And by comparison, the white workers held over $200,000. So that just sort of underscores and puts real numbers on this kind of abstract concept that we talk about in terms of the wealth gap. In terms of your earlier question of kind of what makes for an equitable society, I think my own work over time has focused very much on employee ownership as a tool for sharing wealth. And I think that we have made such advances as a society thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I feel like more and more companies now are adopting some intentionality around those sorts of culture change issues to ensure a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive culture within workplaces. We have much more distance to go on that front. But I always still feel like missing from this is any conversation about the underlying ownership structure and the underlying question of who really has access to the profits. And in addition to wages, I believe that workers, including frontline workers and low-wage workers, if they had a more consistent right to that upside of stock appreciation, of profit, I think we could begin to see some of the kind of material underpinnings of economic inequality begin to shift.
So, Maureen, maybe give us a short version to answer to this, but what impact did COVID and the migration to virtual and hybrid work have on in that inequality?
Yeah, so I think COVID just exacerbated inequalities, right? On so many dimensions, right? So during COVID, people who had higher income jobs, had office jobs, had the ability to stay home, to protect their health, were less likely to lose their paycheck. And the people who were earning lower wages were more likely to either lose their paycheck entirely or to be working in what were then very unsafe working conditions, right? So there was an incredible disparity in that dimension. And I just, I think that right. So that was just profound in terms of, it also had profound differences by race and gender, because of the level of occupational segregation that we have, right, in our labor market, right? So lower wage service work jobs are more likely to be held by women, more likely to be held by workers of color, and so they bore the heaviest burdens of the COVID crisis. And I felt at one point like maybe people were finally starting to understand the value of some of these jobs in the conversation around essential workers, but I feel like that, unfortunately, I feel like that didn't last very long. Because those jobs are still essential. They're still essential. But we haven't done much to try to figure out how those jobs can be more stable for people. And I think to the degree possible, and it's certainly not possible, and employee ownership isn't a silver bullet, to the degree possible to bring employee ownership to those jobs where it makes sense, where that could be a helpful strategy. But there's other strategies we're going to need to make sure that many of those jobs are good jobs and are dignified jobs and respect the essential nature of the work that is being done.
And what are some of the new ideas or initiatives that you're seeing in workforce development?
So I think in workforce development, there has been, I'm hopeful for this a little bit. I mean, there has been a little bit more focus on both on equity and on job quality. I think workforce development has been, sort of, there's been a challenge in workforce development, right, in terms of how we try to guide people into jobs, right? So just like the labor market, I mentioned the level of occupational segregation. So, you have people come in and there hasn't been a lot of, I think historically, workforce development just worked within those employment patterns, right? There were definitely notable exceptions where organizations were, for example, trying to help women get jobs in the trades that were better jobs for them and jobs that could be accessible and would provide them a better living, that would try to help people of color get jobs that they had historically been lacked access to. So I think those were important things, but I think writ large, the larger public workforce system was responsive to employers rather than sort of challenging what are the norms of employment practice, right? So I think there has been more interest in addressing some of those and trying to be a little bit more active to not, again, it's not about challenging employer practice in ways that won't work for the business, right? It's more about sort of saying, we think this is possible within your business, and you could think about how this could work within your business. And I think that that's starting to change, and I think that's really positive. I think there is also some sense that there needs to be more focus on job quality and not just trying to match people to a job and hope that they move up, because we can see from the data that economic mobility is not happening for many people, right? So we can't assume that as long as you get labor force attachment, you'll get labor force advancement. And so I think there's starting to be a recognition that we need to take that issue seriously and do more to figure out what are the strategies to both raise the floor and raise the standards of employment, as well as build ladders and help people advance.
So, Maureen and Adria, can you share your vision for an equitable workforce?
I think I tried to sort of say that an equitable workforce starts with equitable work, right? And I think that is really, I feel like a lot of times when we talk about workforce, we talk about sort of what are services and things that we do for individuals, right? How do we give individual skills and all this kind of thing? There's lots of things about skills gaps and so on. But I think that we pay far too little attention to how is the structure of work, even in things like productivity, right? We make that a function of what are the skills workers bring to work, rather than what are the decisions about how we structure work and how companies invest in their workers and build their productivity. There are choices companies can make to either preference, sort of investing in productivity or labor cost minimization. And, we're not putting our thumb on the scale enough to say we want companies to invest in productivity and invest in good jobs, rather than just trying to do labor cost minimization. And so I think in an equitable workforce and equitable economy, we would really think about how do we put our thumb more on the scale for good jobs, for good jobs as a sign of good business, so that we can build an economy in which we can all thrive.
Thank you, Maureen. And Adria, your thoughts? Do you want to share your thoughts?
I don't know what more I can add to what Maureen just said. Oh my goodness. I think adding to what Maureen said, just the teeniest bit. I think that equitable workplaces can take many different forms, and I think what different communities of workers need may vary. If you are a young mother with a bunch of children at home, in a low income community, versus if you have a more sort of traditional, durable employment relationship and don't have a lot of dependents. There are many different, people, depending on their conditions and their identities, have many different specific needs. But for me, the bottom line is a just workplace provides economic security. It provides psychological security and safety. It is free from discrimination and bias. It's a place where the workers themselves have some voice that can look lots of different ways, but some voice over the conditions of their work and the freedom to speak and articulate their needs. Obviously, strong wages and benefits. And very, very importantly, the opportunity to accumulate wealth in one way or another above and beyond their wage.
Well, I could extend this interview for probably another hour, because we haven't even touched unions or private equity, which obviously could regulatory oversight. But I've thoroughly enjoyed this interview and would love to collaborate with you.